Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Please take a moment, if you haven't already, to click the like icon for liking this week's episode and click on the subscribe buttons for subscribing to our channel and also clicking on the bell icon so you get those weekly reminders when a new episode drops.
That's right. So each week, Todd and I will be talking about the gospel lectionary reading for the upcoming weekend. Our hope is that as we talk about that reading, we're going to talk about it in the context of love and inclusion and societal justice. We want our talking to be just, as in justice, but our hope also is that something might be said during these next few minutes as we're going back and forth that might inspire you alongside with us to do more than just talking. So, Todd, what passage are we looking at this week?
So we're in Matthew 18 again. This week we're in verses 21 through 35 and looking at some conversation and storytelling on forgiveness.
Yeah, so even the most progressive Jesus scholars see this parable of the servant being forgiven and then moving on with a spirit of unforgiveness towards others. um, they see that many of them trace this back. As rare as this is in the Jesus story, even the most progressive Jesus scholars trace this back to the historical Jesus. That this has all the telltale earmarks of being actually, through the oral tradition, being able to trace back all the way to Jesus himself. And it's kind of astounding. I mean, if you think about the magnitude of the story, it does kind of reveal Jesus's tendency to over exaggerate. I mean, it would be one thing to owe someone a bag of gold. That would be a lot of money in and of itself.
Right.
But this guy owes him 10,000 bags of gold. I mean, it's just over the top.
Yeah.
10,000 bags of gold. And the guy just, once he starts pleading, the guy has compassion on him and forgives that massive amount of money. So and I mean, this parable of forgiving as you've been forgiven, there have been some harmful interpretations of it. um and we can talk about those maybe a little bit. The spiritualizing this, taking it out of its economic topic or
Mhm.
context, and and using it to kind of guilt people into forgiving or
Mhm.
letting someone off the hook. It's just a convenient parable for those who have done some bad things to others, to say to someone whom they've harmed, well, you've been forgiven, you need to be a forgiving person.
Yeah.
um, there's just been some harmful interpretations of this passage. Have you witnessed that, Todd?
Oh, sure. There's asking asking people who are the victims uh, to be the ones who are forgiving. I've heard the argument, many times black people just need to forgive white people for
Mm, mm.
for
That's a
what we did, and just and get over it.
mhm.
Uh, and I've also been around domestic violence situations and people who work with domestic violence talking about how often uh, women are told they need to keep forgiving their husbands, 490 times. So definitely, um, we definitely have been in contexts where um, forgiveness is demanded from those who are experiencing the worst of human behavior,
Mm.
which is
Almost like moral value is attached not to what was done to them, but to their lack of forgiveness for what was done to them.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah. What a burden to put on someone um, to suffer, at the hands of another human, and then to place on them the burden of being morally insufficient if they don't, you know, forgive because
Mm.
they've been forgiven. So yeah, I mean, there's some harmful interpretations out there that that have been expressed over the years. So before we, and I want to come back to this, but before we dive too deeply into the spiritualization of this
Hmm.
parable, interpretations of this parable, let's take a step back and just look at its original context economically. Jesus, I'm not convinced that Jesus meant this parable to be an allegory. Um, you have this story. In the story, the one that's forgiven, a gentleman just owes him some silver. You know what I mean? Just a far less insignificant, just a far more insignificant debt in relation to the other, and just holds him for every last penny.
Hmm.
Um, and what if Jesus is, instead of it being universal for everybody to forgive everybody of everything, it was actually directed in his society, in his historical context. It was directed towards the rich, wealthy creditors,
Right.
saying, "You've been forgiven so much of your debt to God. Can you not cancel the small monetary debt that people have towards you?" It was another one of the moments in the Jesus story tradition where there is this call for the year of Jubilee, which was
Mhm.
a deep Torah principle of where debt was supposed to be canceled in order to prevent poverty and disenfranchisement. I mean, in Luke 4:18 through 19, in the Gospel of Luke, there, Jesus's entire gospel ministry is summed up through proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, which is the year when all debts were forgiven. And in Matthew 6:2, in this Gospel of Matthew, in the Lord's Prayer, the early versions say, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors."
Yeah.
Luke's version, which is newer, younger, came about later, universalizes it to forgive us our sins as we forgive everyone who sins against us. And over time, I can see how it evolved from being, especially as the social location of the church changed, where the wealthy become, Jesus followers. It's
Hmm.
now important to make this about relational forgiveness rather than the canceling of debts, which is what the Torah demanded. It's what Jesus was teaching. It's one of the areas, I don't know how far we want to go into this, but it's one of the areas in which one of the few areas that Jesus digresses from the teachings of Hillel in his Jewishness. On almost everything else of defining the Torah as loving your neighbor and defining fidelity to the God of the Torah as being love and compassion and inclusion, he's almost lockstep with the Pharisaical school of Hillel, the teachings of Hillel,
Hmm.
until it comes down to this. And we know historically that Hillel sided with the wealthy. Hillel created the prosbul, which stated that any creditor could label a debt that someone owed them as prosbul, and then it would be immune to the year of Jubilee.
Hmm.
And on that note, Jesus, and there's a couple others, but on that note specifically, Jesus says, no, that's not the spirit of the Torah. That's not the aim or the goal of the Torah. The Torah was every 50 years, liquefy all debt, cancel all debt, set all slaves free, return all land to its original owner, hit a 50-year reset so that
Yeah.
there will, Deuteronomy 15, never be any poor among you. I mean, when Jesus says the poor you will always have with you, he wasn't saying that as a intrinsic, reality of just the way the world is and there's nothing we can do about it. He was
Right.
saying, listen, because you're choosing not to follow the Torah
Yeah.
in regards to debt cancellation specifically, where Deuteronomy 15 promises that if you do this, you will never have any poor people in your society. Jesus is saying, you're not following it, you're going to always have poor people in your society. You're going to you're doing the opposite of what we were, encouraged to do or commanded to do. But yeah, so there is an economic element to this
Yeah,
parable.
and I think this is just again one of those things where those of us who've grown up in the Christian faith and have listened to well-meaning pastors and Bible teachers and Sunday school teachers and things like
Of
that.
which I was one at one time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have been taught to spiritualize every passage that has to do with money. When we talk about the rich young ruler being asked to sell all he has to give to the poor, no, that's a spiritual lesson. That's not an actual economic lesson. And here in this parable of forgiving debt, we say no, that's about how you forgive one another's sins. But I think you have to take the the actual wording seriously. Um, because again you're looking at Jesus addressing issues of governance, of economics throughout the gospels, so it would make sense that this part is also addressing an economic uh, situation, um, and calling the Jewish people back to uh, and not the Jewish people, but Jewish leaders, Jewish wealthy, uh, to 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 follow Jubilee law, and just in general have a much more compassionate stance towards
Yeah,
others.
I'm sure that the majority of those who owed somebody something within the Jewish society back then would have been more than happy to see this brought back. You know what I mean?
Yep,
Yeah, it
absolutely.
was the elites and the wealthy. It was a classist rejection, not a Jewish rejection.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, and I freely admit this in my blog this week. I'm not a fan of the evolution, taking it out of the economic application and making it more universal about all sins, because 70 times 7, some people say, well, the implication is if they really repent, they're going to change. And my pushback to that is, if they're coming back 490 times, how much change is actually really happening? I mean,
Right.
what you're communicating when you universalize it is that it doesn't matter how many times they do the same stinking thing,
Right.
you as a Jesus follower have to forgive them. And that, well, for one, it's been lethal. You brought up
Right.
domestic violence. It's been lethal advice for many. But two, that interpretation cuts even against how we're taught to practice forgiveness. We're not taught to practice forgiveness with no change on the other side. Restorative justice, forgiveness means we seek restorative justice rather than punitive or
Right.
justice or just vengeance.
Right.
Forgiveness means we lay hold of the humanity, the one that has hurt us. And restorative justice still holds the person accountable, has them make restitution and reparations, and because they need to identify with what they've actually done for their own change's sake, so that they can change, so they can be restored. It's for their benefit too, that they be held to an account, that they be held accountable, and not just letting off the hook. And so I think I mean, even the spiritualization, if someone wants to go in a spiritual application of this parable, we even have to be careful there that we're not teaching a type of forgiveness that's harmful for victims or
Right.
survivors.
Right. This has to be very clearly stated that it's the person in power and authority who is being asked to forgive, or being commanded to forgive debts
To
to
cancel debt, that's right.
that's that's what's happening. If it's if it's flipped the other way, it becomes abusive. It becomes easily manipulated, and it doesn't accomplish any good for either person. Forgiving someone who keeps harming you again and again is not doing anything good for you as the one who's being harmed. And it's not like you said, Herb, it's not
Yeah.
holding the other person accountable and asking that person to make restitution.
It's of no benefit to them either holistically. I mean, they're being let off the hook, so they're getting away with it. But there's nothing really holistically life giving being done for the other person either.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we've done a lot of bad interpretation when we talk about how you always need to forgive, always need to forgive, always need to forgive. No, there's times you shouldn't forgive, and there's times you should not uh, continue to put yourself in the victim location. Um,
If by forgiveness what we mean is just letting the person off the hook, I couldn't agree more. If by forgiveness we mean just simply transitioning from vengeance to a restorative justice, I'm a big fan of restorative justice.
sure.
You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
we could define forgiveness that way. I'm just thinking in my head of all the people in my past who would freak out at saying we don't need to forgive people. Well, no, I think we need to define what that forgiveness is. If you're going to demand forgiveness as a mandatory ethic of following Jesus, a mandatory practice, then we
Mm,
need to define it in such a way that it is not problematic and doesn't do greater harm, that it's not death dealing.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you would find a lot. You would find mental health practitioners who would speak against this universal forgiveness
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
for a person's own mental health, let alone the person who's doing harm. A mental health practitioner, um, they would tell that person, no, instead you need to cut that person off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A healthy
Separate,
boundary. A healthy boundary. Yeah.
set boundaries and firm boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So something I appreciate about what you said a minute ago, you brought in social location. This was this was originally the command for creditors, wealthy creditor, elite, property privileged, powerful creditors to cancel the debts of their debtors. And what has happened through the evolution of this parable is it's been flipped in its universal application. It really hasn't stayed universal. It's been excuse me, mostly applied to victims and survivors, those on
Mhm.
the receiving end of the abuse. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that insight, Todd, because yeah, it was originally meant for oppressors. It was the command for oppressors to do justly. And what it has become is a call for the oppressed to let people off the hook.
Right.
And yeah, yeah. So in this economic element, if we lean into that interpretation, I can't help but think of how many times in the last 2 years I've heard Christians rail against certain progressive economic ideas like forgiving student loans.
Hmm.
And it seems that their comments are just grossly uninformed by parables like this. And these are Christians. These are people who, they've got their ticket for heaven later,
Right.
you know, and yet when something like a year of Jubilee is being offered to a certain group of people, man, I can't put into words how loud their objections were over the
Right.
last couple years.
Right. Yeah. I it's just again the way I I hate this word because it's used in bad ways against other people, but the way that Christians have been groomed over the years to support this idea of being wealthy, being self-sufficient and without debt means you are a morally superior person.
Blessed and favored.
And those who are in debt, who are poor, who are economically struggling, are more immoral than moral, and so therefore it's justified to hold poor people accountable, to hold people in debt accountable, um, and it would be wrong to let them off the hook.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's almost like it becomes the opposite where those that are wronged, they have to let other people off the hook, but God forbid the oppressor ever be called to let them off the hook.
Right.
Yeah.
Because that would
And
be
I also,
immoral.
right, right. And I thought not just about student loans, I thought even globally, a lot of countries, when when colonial nations were giving nations they had colonized over the years their independence, they were giving them their independence and their freedom, but only after they had loaded these countries with economic debt to
Mhm.
them that they owed. It was a way of still maintaining colonialism. That lots of these countries would go into debt to to develop, to
Yeah.
develop their country in the
Right.
ways that capitalist countries are developed, and and what that ended up doing was creating massive amounts of debt for them. And the people who got the benefit were the global corporations that could now go into a more developed country and exploit their resources
Mhm.
less expensively and more easily. So the people that have benefited were the globalists, the rich, wealthy again. The people that were harnessed with the debt were these countries, and the people they owned the debt to were the ones they had just declared independence from. You know what I mean? And so what would it look like if we just went back to, if all global debt was canceled, if we practiced a
Yeah.
global year of jubilee and
Wow.
everybody just went back to grounds? That would turn the whole world upside down.
Yeah. That would.
That would be amazing.
It would.
And some people say, well, that's just pie in the sky. But sometimes I think it's helpful to imagine what a world like that could look like. Because then if
Yeah.
you can see it, if you can imagine it, maybe you can take a step towards it, no matter how small that step is. I think of Christians. What if just Christians began to practice a year of Jubilee? What if Christian
Right.
towards other Christians, even, I'm
Right.
thinking about faith-based hospitals with
Mm-hmm.
medical debt,
Mm-hmm.
Christian universities with
Yep.
student debt. What if Christians just started forgiving other Christians of their debt every 50 years?
Yeah.
I mean, there's where could we? There's just all kinds of, what ifs that come out of this discussion for me.
And that, I mean, and you think about it, even just churches on their own, and then individual churches, could have some real impact for a certain segment of their own community if they just began to practice giving back. Uh, if they said every 7 years we're going to give back a little, and every 50 years we're going to like really pay off some debt of some a chunk of folks in our community, and really see what I mean. If you had, I mean, and I now I live in Louisiana, and the number of churches that I pass on the road every day just going to work, there's so many churches down here that if they all did their share of just on their own relieving some suffering of some people, and that became their ministry of economic liberation. um, wow, I mean,
Yeah,
there
there
could
are
be some
ministries
huge.
out there that raise funds They're nonprofits. They raise funds just to be able to pay off people's medical debts
Yeah,
and send them a letter stating their debt has been paid for them.
it's
And that's a
fantastic.
little different than just canceling the debt, but it's a step towards it.
Right. Yeah, it's not. It's still not the privileged, powerful canceling the debt. It's somebody else stepping in and finding a different way to pay off the debt. But yeah, that. I mean,
It still
if
brings about liberation.
brings about liberation, if churches were to engage in that type of liberation more often, churches might start experiencing uh, new interest in being part of churches. If churches are looking for a way to attract people to them, it could be by helping
Actually doing some
liberate,
real good.
hmm?
Actually doing some real good. Some
Doing some
concrete
real
good.
good, not putting on a better program, but
Right.
actually uh, uh, making people's lives better. It could be a powerful, powerful thing.
So again, if we were to take the economic teachings of Jesus in the four gospels and refuse to spiritualize every single one of them, but take them just for a moment, take them literally and ask, is there a consistent thread in all of these? I think what we'll begin to see is that Jesus did have an economic vision for the world,
Mhm.
and it was radical, but it was life-giving, and it would challenge many of us who have bought into the economic values that we live by today. And I know we can't necessarily jettison ourselves from the system, but it could shape how we relate to the system and maybe how we even shape the system ourselves.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. This is revolutionary stuff. Um,
I
at
mean,
least
debt cancel the last group of people that should be anti debt cancellation is Christians, Jesus followers.
right.
I mean, this was core to Jesus's teaching
That's
that
right.
debt should be forgiven.
That's right.
Yeah. That's what I got this week, Todd.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say it enough. This is it's amazing how effectively we have covered this up by spiritualizing all this stuff of Jesus, and we miss out on the actual revolution that he was trying to accomplish in his time, and that we can still seek to follow in our time. This has been one of the greatest cover-ups in history, how Jesus has been misinterpreted intentionally and unintentionally.
And all of that can be traced back to when the social location of the church changed.
Yep. The early church understood it and were living it out. And then when the church became the religion of empire, then it started to change.
Mhm.
So,
Well, Todd, where can we find you, man?
well, you can find me on my website, toddjleonard.com. And Herb, where can we can find you?
You can find me at renewedheartministries.com and all the links after that you'll find there to where that leads you.
All right. Thanks to everybody for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks everyone for watching.